Welcome to Sleep with Myth. Close your eyes and let the world fade away. Tonight we drift beyond time, where gods dream and stories remember their light. There was once a city that forgot how to listen. Its towers were made of glass and wind, its streets braided like rivers of light. Every surface murmured, every arch remembered a footfall. Every plaza rehearsed the music of mornings and departures. Merchants sang their prices with bells. The water clocks chimed constellations. Even the bridges whispered maps to those who crossed them. Noise was not nuisance in this place, it was citizenship. To be heard was to belong. And yet, in the heart of the city, the sound that began everything had grown thin. The old ones called it the breath, a quiet that once lived beneath all voices. It was said that when the city was young and the temples still smelled of rain, the gods taught its first builders to rest their tools and feel a wind that carried neither dust nor scent. A wind that entered through the ribs and left through the eyes. The breath was silence, but not absence. It was the room that allowed sound to be true. It was, as the city rose higher and brighter, the breath faded into legend. Work moved faster. Nights grew shorter. The bells multiplied, then forgot why they rang. If a child asked about stillness, they were told to learn a louder craft. If someone paused at sunset to hear the hum of the earth beneath the paving stones, a neighbor would clap them on the back and ask for the time. And so the city filled itself and filled until fullness became a kind of fear. There was one who remembered. She was called Sarah of the Thresholds, though most knew her simply as the listener. She kept the last key to the old chapels no one visited, held the names of streets before they were renamed for donors, and walked with a step so soft that dust hardly minded her passing. She wore a cloak the color of evening and carried a small book with pages that refused to accept ink. When asked why she guarded an empty ledger, she smiled and said, "It is for what is not said." Sarah lived above the Echo Market, in a room with a single window and a shelf made from a pew. At dawn she would open the shutters and let the city speak through the frame. Hawkers calling quince and cumin, wheels dreaming of distance, a kettle announcing itself as river steam. By noon the sound became a cloth, one she could fold, smooth, and lift to see what had been hidden beneath it. By night she listened for the breath, and found only the sleeping of birds. On the morning the story truly begins, a tremor of quiet passed through the city. It began in the oldest bricks, in the mortar that remembered wet hands and the names of masons. It rose through wells that no one drew and staircases that went nowhere. It touched the iron bells and made them consider their weight. It pressed gently against the walls of the palace where the council of voices convened, and then it went to the place in the city that had almost forgotten it existed, the temple of first silence. Sarah felt it like a finger tracing a circle on the inside of her chest. She closed her shutters. The market continued pretending to be an ocean. Pigeons argued the law of bread. Somewhere, a clock mistook itself for thunder. But the tremor remained, not in the world outside her window, but in the space the world made inside her. "It has returned," she whispered. She took the key from its hook and went out without her shoes. The stone of the stair remembered her feet. The city's morning washed around her like speech around a secret. She walked east, where the streets narrowed and the light at their ends looked like promises. The temple of first silence sat where the city had been born, a low courtyard of pale stone, a gate of cedar burned black by time, and columns that held nothing but sky. No god statue stood within, no altar for offering, no basin for ablution. The builders had taught that the temple itself was a held breath. To enter was to lay down the need to be seen and to receive the right to be present. The cedar gate was ajar. Sarah hesitated. The temple kept itself. No wind opened its doors. Inside, the courtyard was filled with light like milk poured into a bowl. Dust hung without falling, as though an old story had been interrupted mid-sentence. Sarah stepped past the gate and felt the sound of her own heart separate into two parts. The beat that blood makes, and the beat that memory keeps. Someone was there already. At the center of the courtyard, a child sat cross-legged, hands open on their knees. Their eyes were closed, their breath a soft tide. They wore a tunic stitched with small bright beads that caught the light in different flavors. A traveler's garment or a gift from someone who loved the morning. Sarah did not speak. She waited. The temple had no doorkeeper. It taught anyone who entered to become one. After a time, the child lifted their head. "I dreamed this place," they said, not surprised to find Sarah there. "In my dream it was full." "Full of what?" Sarah asked. The child considered. "Listening." Sarah's mouth became a line that only she knew to be a smile. "And what did you hear?" "The last echo," the child said. "The one the gods left." Something old and kind moved under the floor, like roots waking. Sarah knelt so that their faces were level. "Tell me your name," she said. The child shook their head. "Not mine. It's—" They placed a hand on the stone. "The city." Sarah put her palm flat against the floor. The stone was warmer than sun could account for. Beneath it, not far but not near, something shaped like a word and larger than language turned slowly in its sleep. "You felt the tremor," Sarah said. The child nodded. "It came into my chest and sat like a bird that isn't afraid." "You have good teachers." "I have a grandmother," the child said. "She cannot hear very well, but she listens better than anyone." Sarah pressed her lips together. "The city's breath is thinning," she said. "What did you see when you dreamed of this place full?" The child closed their eyes again. "Not people," they said. "Places, streets, balconies, ovens, wells, the river when it was still shallow, the benches where the old men keep their stories, the storeroom under the library where they put the books that forget to end." Sarah's heart stumbled. "You saw the archive." The child opened one eye. "Is that a room?" "It is where the city keeps what it would lose if left to memory alone." "I saw another thing," the child said. "A door." Sarah became entirely still. "What kind of door?" "A heavy one," the child said. "But kind." Sarah felt the key in her hand as if it had just been made. The blank book under her cloak grew heavier, as though something unwritten had leaned against it. "Will you show me where you saw it?" Sarah asked. The child stood. "I think the door will show us," they said. "If we listen." They left the temple together. The cedar gate swung almost closed, then changed its mind and remained ajar, as if the temple itself wished to be certain that someone would come back. They walked west, then north, then west again, following no plan Sarah recognized and every intention her bones did. The city shifted around them, streets shortening or lengthening as needed, alleys stepping aside like courteous elders. The air tasted of quince and brick. Sarah began to notice absences. A bell that did not ring at the hour, a fountain that hummed without its usual joke. The city was not making less noise, she realized. It was making room. They reached the archive's outer wall. A long curve of stone without ornament, the color of sleep. Above the lintel hung the old motto no one read anymore, because no one looked up when passing under a doorway. Let nothing be forced but silence. Sarah pressed her palm to the stone. The wall felt like night. "Here," said the child, pointing to a place without mark or seam. "The door." Sarah laughed softly. Of course. The door was not invisible. It was perfectly present. It had simply chosen not to ask for attention. Sarah slipped the key from her sleeve. It was iron weathered by tears and the oil of faithful hands. No one had taught her how to use it. It had taught her. She lifted it toward the stone. Not to insert, not to turn, but to be recognized. The wall exhaled. Stone became shadow. Shadow became space. A cool breath drifted outward, carrying a scent that could not be named because it was the smell of a book before it is written. Sarah and the child stepped through. The archive was not a hall or a vault. It was a city dreaming beneath the city. Streets made of recollection, bridges of promise, fountains bubbling with words kept for later. Lanterns hung where lamps could not reach. Their light did not reveal the dust, but asked it to dance. Shelves ran along thoroughfares like colonnades, holding items that knew both stories and their silences. A bowl with a crack that remembered a marriage, a child's shoe that insisted on being left untied, and or smoothed by both departure and return. "Listen," Sarah said. The child tilted their head. "Is that singing?" Sarah nodded. "The city when it rests. It does not dream very often anymore." They walked until the streets of memory narrowed into a spiral staircase. At its center, a chamber waited. The door to the chamber was heavy indeed, not because it resisted, but because it held a trust. It was made of the same cedar as the temple gate, and it had burned the same way, from within. Sarah raised the key again. "We should only open this if it asks," the child said. Sarah smiled. "Yes." They waited. The chamber considered them the way a poem considers the reader. Then the cedar door released the scent of rain and laid the memory of a palm against Sarah's cheek. She touched the key to its heart. The door swung inward. Inside was nothing. Not emptiness. Not dark. Not a room unfilled. Inside was the breath the city had been losing, gathered like winter light under wool. Sarah took a single step forward, and the absence spoke. Not with words, with permission. The child gasped. Their eyes filled with tears that did not fall. It knows me. Sarah felt the book under her cloak open its blank mouth. She took it out and waited. The nameless pages held still, and then, slowly, letters began to rise from the paper like heat from sunlit stone. Sarah watched a line write itself, in a hand she had known only once before, on the day the city first brought her here as a child. The gods left an echo so the city would not have to shout to be heard. Sarah looked at the child. Do you understand what that means? The child nodded. We do not need to make more sound. We need to make more room. The breath swelled and touched their faces like a hand that remembered them as infants. It did not ask them to be quiet. It invited them to become quiet. This was the difference the city had forgotten. Silence forced becomes fear. Silence welcomed becomes home. What happens now? The child asked. Sarah folded the book closed. The letters that had written themselves remained on the page, but they no longer weighed anything. Now the city will remember how to listen, she said. But it will do so like a person learning to sleep again after many nights awake. Slowly, and with small awakenings that feel like loss until they feel like rest. The child reached out a hand. Sarah took it. Together they turned back to the door that was not a door and stepped into the archive streets of sleeping light. As they walked, a sound rose far above them. Nothing like bells or water clocks or bridges speaking their names. It was the sound of kitchens setting down their pans at the same moment, of scribes lifting their pens to consider a word together, of a city remembering that listening is also a way to speak. Sarah looked down. The floor's stone had become warm. She smiled into the almost dark. "Welcome home," she said to the silence. The morning after Sarah and the child stepped from the archive, the city did not wake in the way it once did. Its sounds were slower, as though each bell had turned to ask its echo for permission before ringing. Market stalls opened a little later. The smell of baking bread lingered longer in the streets. Even the pigeons seemed to argue more softly, as if their wings had learned the rhythm of breathing again. But below all this gentle rearranging, the old stones of the city trembled. It was not fear. It was recognition. The breath had returned, faint and unfamiliar, like rain falling into a well that had forgotten the taste of water. And the stones, the keepers of all footsteps, all shouts, all unspoken promises, began to hum in their sleep. Sarah walked beside the child through the quiet. The morning light was pale and forgiving, pouring over tiled roofs that glistened like wet parchment. She listened, not to words, not to the ordinary music of the city, but to the intervals between sounds, the small, holy pauses that carried meaning deeper than any syllable. The child glanced up at her. "Do you hear it?" "Yes," Sarah said. "It's remembering. The city." She nodded. "The stone, the air, the breath that holds everything together. They are all pieces of the same voice." They passed beneath an archway that once marked the entrance to the Council of Voices, a grand hall where laws were not spoken but sung. Now the great bronze doors stood closed, not in defiance, but in contemplation. Someone had carved words across them, ancient and deliberate, Let the echo rest. Let the word return home. Sarah traced the engraving with her fingertips. The grooves felt warm. She turned to the child. Do you know what this means? The child shook their head. It means that even the loudest word must one day find silence, not as punishment, but as belonging. They walked onward. Along the way they found others waiting, not gathered by command, but drawn by something older than instruction. A baker wiping flour from her hands, a blacksmith whose hammer lay still, an old poet whose mouth shaped verses no one could hear but everyone could feel. The people of the city had begun to sense the tremor too. They didn't speak of it, but they moved with it, as if silence itself had become a rhythm to follow. In the square by the northern aqueduct, water no longer roared. It flowed as though listening to its own descent. Children played nearby, their laughter quiet but full, like candles burning without smoke. For the first time in generations, no one shouted above another. Sarah watched them. Her cloak caught the light, not of the sun, but of the stillness that lay between each heartbeat. This is how it begins, she whispered. The child frowned. How what begins? The remembering. They continued toward the heart of the city, where the great bell tower, once called the voice of dawn, pierced the pale sky. Its bell had not rung since before Sarah was born. The tower's gears had seized from neglect, its ropes stiffened by centuries of noise that left no room for rest. And yet, as they approached, a faint vibration moved through the stones beneath their feet, the same quiet tremor that had visited Sarah's heart in the temple. The child tilted their head. It's singing. Sarah smiled. Not yet, but it's breathing. They climbed the tower's narrow spiral stair. Each step sounded softer than the last, as if the city itself was cushioning their ascent. When they reached the top, the vast bell loomed above them, massive, bronze, and dusted with the silver of forgotten prayers. Its lip bore an inscription long hidden by soot. When the gods ceased to speak, the world learned to hear. Sarah touched the letters and felt them pulse, faintly alive. Do you think it remembers the gods? The child asked. Sarah gazed out across the rooftops. The city stretched like a sleeping giant, its streets curling around its heart. I think the gods were never gone, she said softly. They were only waiting for us to stop shouting. The bell shivered. Once, twice. The air thickened, luminous, as though the morning itself were listening. Sarah laid her hand against the cold metal. You don't need to speak, she whispered. Just breathe. A deep tone resonated, not a sound, but a feeling. The bell exhaled. The city sighed in answer. Below them, windows opened, doors unlatched. People stepped into the streets, not to speak, but to feel the weight lift from their chests. The baker set down her basket of loaves. The poet closed his eyes and mouthed a single word that could not be heard. The child gripped Sarah's hand. It's awake, they said. Sarah nodded. Tears, or something like them, shimmered in her eyes. Yes, she whispered. The city remembers the sound of its own silence. They stood there together, as the bell tower breathed light instead of noise. And far beneath them, in the deep bones of the city, the old stones began to murmur once more, softly, tenderly, as if telling each other, we were never alone. The breath had returned, but its work had only begun. The city had learned to hum even when no one spoke. Its towers were tuned to the rhythm of absence. Its streets carried echoes like memories that refused to fade. And yet, in the center of it all, beneath the marble and glass, something ancient was stirring. Long ago, before stone and steel, before the first name was given to a place, the gods had walked through silence. They did not speak, they resonated. Every step they took shaped the tone of existence, and their rest became the quiet where mortals would one day dream. But when the last god left the world, the silence that remained was not sacred. It was hollow, a wound that sang. The city grew in that wound. It was not born of faith, but of forgetting. And in forgetting, it built itself higher, faster, brighter, until no shadow could rest upon its walls. Yet shadows always find a way. In the oldest district, beyond the light of the mirrored spires, a man walked through the empty corridors of what was once a temple. His name was lost to time, but he was the last listener. He carried a device, a relic made from the glass of forgotten altars. When held to the air, it vibrated faintly, as though the silence itself were whispering back. He paused before the great statue at the heart of the ruin. It no longer resembled any god known to humankind. Its face had eroded into smoothness, the absence of memory. But in that emptiness he felt something awaken. A pulse, a breath, a single sound that did not belong to this age. He fell to his knees, pressing the device to the ground. The vibration deepened, and beneath the surface of the city, something answered. It was not a voice. It was a memory of one, older than language, older than the idea of speaking. The ground trembled as the walls began to resonate, and for a brief moment the city itself listened. Windows shuddered, mirrors dimmed, machines paused mid-motion, as though holding their breath. The hum that had filled every space for centuries stopped. The listener rose slowly. He looked around, feeling the stillness settle like dust. He whispered, "Can you hear us?" And though the gods had been gone for an age, something answered, not from above, but from within. The silence replied. When the silence fell, it did not end like sound. It unfolded, like an ancient fabric being revealed from beneath the dust of centuries. And beneath it, the city remembered. Once, it had been called Elethra, the breath of gods. Now, even its name was a rumor that the wind had forgotten to tell. But the silence carried memory. It moved through the towers like mist, touching every wall, every sleeping machine, every pulse of power beneath the earth. The listener walked through streets where sound no longer dared to exist. Every footstep became an act of devotion, every breath a confession. He began to hear things he had never noticed before. Not sound, but resonance. The low hum of meaning beneath existence. The quiet heartbeats of the world itself. The statues wept, not water, but dust. The rivers dimmed, reflecting not light, but the faint outline of something vast beyond the sky. And through it all he felt her, the last echo of the gods. She was not a being of form or flame. She was the space between heartbeat and breath, the moment before creation decides to be born again. Her voice entered him like the first dawn after endless rain. You have called me back, though you did not know my name. He fell to his knees. I didn't mean to, he whispered. I was only listening, and that is all creation ever needed. The silence did not end, it transformed. From it rose a sound so gentle, so deep, it felt like the heartbeat of eternity itself. The listener stood amidst the stillness, his hands trembling, for he understood. This was not silence's death, it was its awakening. All across Elethra, echoes began to bloom like flowers. Whispers from forgotten prayers, breaths from the dying gods, laughter from the first dawn of humankind. They spiraled together, weaving a song no mortal could compose. The song of remembrance. Every tower became an instrument of that melody. The stones resonated. Glass shimmered with unseen light. The sky turned dark, but not from night, from depth, as if the heavens themselves had leaned closer to listen. And the listener, in his frail mortal form, became the vessel through which the city remembered its own divinity. He heard every life that had ever been lived, every voice that had been silenced, and every word that had never needed to be spoken. He understood, then, what the gods had always known, that creation is not born from speaking, but from listening. And so he listened until the melody faded, until the silence returned not as void, but as peace. In that quiet, the figure of light, the last echo, approached him. She placed a hand upon his heart, and through the stillness, her voice flowed like warm wine through ancient stone. You have restored what was forgotten. The gods do not need to return, for you have learned to hear again. The listener bowed his head, and when he lifted it once more, the city was gone, replaced by a single ripple across an infinite sea of quiet stars. Dawn rose without a trumpet. It arrived as a hand laid gently on a sleeping shoulder. Elethra opened its eyes. No bells greeted the sun. No proclamations crossed the plazas. Kitchens did not clang. Hammers did not petition the morning with sparks. And yet the city was not empty. It was full of a different brightness, one that did not glare, one that did not demand to be seen. It simply waited to be met. Sarah stood in the temple of first silence with the child at her side. The cedar gate was open not from neglect but from welcome. It had learned, like the rest of the city, that doors are not the guardians of boundaries but the hosts of thresholds. They're listening, the child whispered. Sarah nodded. She could feel it in her ribs, between the beats, a poised, gentle expectancy. Far away, across the quarter of workshops, the breath of 1,000 sleeping bellows rose and fell in time. Nearer still, within the courtyard, the light hovered as if it had chosen not to scatter. Today, Sarah said, we will see whether listening can become belonging. They walked out into streets the city had given back to feet. Horse hooves tested the stones as though remembering a dance. The baker had placed her loaves along the sill and stepped back, as if food were a kind of song, and would sing louder without her voice. The old poet sat on the bench beneath the fig tree, eyes closed, lips moving to a rhythm the leaves seemed eager to hear. When they reached the bell tower, The listener was already there. He stood with both hands resting against the bronze, a posture not of effort but of reverence. He did not pull any rope. He did not coax with pleading. He breathed. The bell brightened. A soundless tone poured outward, widening like rings on water, moving over rooftops and down alleyways, through bakeries and courts and the rooms where children had not yet learned the alphabet of loss. People felt it arrive and, without instruction, placed their hands over their hearts. Some knelt. Some laughed under their breath as if a long-forgotten joke had returned. Some wept without tears. The tone moved into the archive, where lanterns lifted their wicks like listening birds. It crept along shelves that held bowls with remembered cracks and shoes with remembered distances. It reached the cedar door within the spiral of recollection and found it open. Inside waited the breath, gathered like winter light beneath wool. The tone and the breath regarded one another, not as stranger and host, as kin. Sarah and the child entered the archive. The city's quiet had grown so steady that even their footsteps felt like gratitude. The listener followed, leaving the bell to its soft shining. They stood together at the threshold of the inner chamber as warmth met them, not with heat, but with recognition. The blank book under Sarah's cloak grew light. She opened it. The pages did not write themselves, for they were no longer empty. The words that had belonged there had moved to where they had always wished to live, into the chests of those who waited. "Do you remember the line?" Sarah asked the child. The child nodded. The gods left an echo so the city would not have to shout to be heard. "And what does it mean?" the listener asked, voice barely more than a thought. "That we were never supposed to fill the air," the child said. "We were supposed to make room for it." The breath swelled, and the chamber widened without expanding. It felt like standing within a single heartbeat that belonged to everyone and no one. The listener bowed his head. Sarah closed her eyes. The child reached forward and placed a palm on the space where a door should have been but was not. A current passed through them, clear, tender, and without urgency. Carried a message, not as language but as permission. Bekeepers, not keepers. Hosts, not owners. Witnesses, not walls. Sarah lifted her eyes. "Then let's give it back." They left the archive and stepped into the morning that had chosen not to announce itself. The current went with them, not behind as a memory nor ahead as a promise, but beside, like a friend who needs no introduction. When they reached the square by the aqueduct, the city had gathered. Infants breathed with mouths open, as if tasting a new kind of milk. Artisans stood with empty hands. Judges stood without judgment. The council of voices, those who once insisted the city be heard, waited in a line not to speak but to be present. Sarah lifted her palm. Not high, not to command, simply to be seen by those in front and felt by those behind. No one spoke. There was no proclamation, no edict, no vow. There was only a small, deliberate act. The first shared breath the city had taken since it learned to be loud. Inhale. A brightening. The light pooled at their feet. Exhale. A warming. The stones softened beneath their weight. Inhale. A widening. Space entering the room people keep behind their faces. Exhale. A returning. Home, arriving. The listener within the listener, the oldest part of him, the one the gods had once trusted, opened like a window. He heard it clearly now. The last echo was not a remaining note. It was a living room in which all notes could rest. The bell tone returned, softer than before, more human. Not above them, not around them, but among them. It went first to the baker. Her shoulders dropped. She smiled without performance. It touched the blacksmith. He set the hammer down for the first time at noon. It moved through the poet like rain through dust. And he finally spoke a single word, out loud, for the city to carry. Stay. A quiet laughter rippled, not at him but with him. The word did not insist. It did not bind. It belonged because it asked for nothing. Sarah reached for the child's hand. Will you help me carry this? How? By not closing any doors that wish to stay open. The child nodded and looked toward the neighborhoods where streets forget their endings. I'll start there. The council approached. Their spokeselder, hands empty of scepters, bowed to Sarah, then to the listener, then most deeply to the child. What do we do, listener? The elder asked. The listener smiled, an expression so unfamiliar on his face that some in the square looked up in wonder. Learn to be quiet together, he said, not as silence forced, but as silence welcomed. Choose hours when we listen. Choose places where sound is allowed only to rest. Laws, customs, Sarah answered. Let the city teach us. We will make fewer rules than rooms. The elder sighed, relief appearing on breath like mist. Then we will unbind our schedules for one day each week. We will keep the market soft until the second of calls. The bells will breathe light instead of iron. And the archive? Another counselor asked. Unlocked, Sarah said. Not to take, but to return what we have carried too long. The child pointed toward the tower. And the bell. It will ring when we remember to listen, the listener said. And it will rest when we forget, so that forgetting turns us back toward remembering. The agreements passed through the crowd the way dusk passes through a tree, touching each leaf uniquely, making a single darkness that belongs to no one. Mothers set their infants against their chests and swayed. Apprentices exhaled. Elders' hands stopped trembling. The city did not change. It remembered itself. Evening came without edges. Lamps were lit, but their light did not push. It accompanied. The streets held their gatherings quietly, stories told in a tone that trusted the listener would remain. Someone in the northern quarter set a bowl upon a windowsill, a symbol older than this city and every city, to welcome the traveler who arrives while the house is asleep. Sarah climbed the bell tower alone as the first stars discussed the old constellations. At the top she found no ropes, no levers, no mechanisms to pull. Only the bronze, cooled by dusk, and the sky warmed by breath. She placed her palm against the bell and waited. Within its stillness, she heard a new sound, softer than memory, clearer than prophecy. It was the city itself, humming not to be heard, but to belong. Thank you, Sarah whispered, not to a god, not to a thing, but to a living room made of listening. The bell did not ring. It breathed, and across Elethra, People turned their faces toward the night with the kind of ease that only returns when no one fears being left alone with their thoughts. They were not alone. The last echo was with them, not as a relic to worship, but as a practice to share. The child stood in the doorway of the temple of first silence, gazing up at the moon. They raised one hand, then another, as if framing a picture no wall could hold. "Welcome home," they told the dark. Home answered with the sound every home makes when someone comes in without knocking, without fear, without need to prove they belong. It was not a word. It was a room. And in that room the city slept well for the first time in an age, dreaming in a language with no alphabet, breathing with a rhythm that could be kept by anyone who remembered to listen. Thank you for listening to Sleep with Myth.